Okay, good morning. The title of the lecture I'd like to deliver is Destined for War with a question mark. Question mark because the thesis that was published by Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University is still questionable for me. That is, of course, relating originally and also in my lecture to the problem of Sino-American relations, or to be more exact, to the American strategy of Joe Biden in comparative perspective, hence having in mind the strategy of Barack Obama and the strategy of Donald Trump. I based the talk on three preliminary hypotheses, presuming that Joe Biden's strategy is based on objective cost-benefit analysis of power transformation between the United States and China on the one hand, and tries to juxtapose or include both perspectives of his predecessors, hence Barack Obama and Donald Trump's. Even though we normally perceived those perspectives as totally contradictory, the reality, according to my hypothesis, was both followed similar objectives, however, used different tools. Those different tools, different instruments of foreign policy adopted by Barack Obama and Donald Trump could be rooted into two theoretical backgrounds. Neo-functional background for Barack Obama and classical realist background for Donald Trump. What is also important, and I will try to focus on this here as well, is the assessment of American power as we perceive Sino-American relations as competition for global power. Hence, I presume that American power, American global dominance, is based on three dimensions. There would be the relative capabilities or aggregated power, as we can say. I'll explain this in a moment. The support of international institutions, what I would call regulatory position, and the middle powers allegiance, that US is absolutely dominating in this third sphere. As I've already mentioned, the starting point of my talk and thoughts preceding it is the book published by Harvard-based Professor Graham Allison, using the quite popular allegory of Thucydides' trap. The book was entitled Destined for War with a question mark, and presumed that both countries would most likely wage a war that is caused by a systemic factor. If we would try to root it in IR theories, international relations theories, I would focus on those two aspects. The realist theory, or theory rooted in realist paradigm called power transition theory, created by Abramo Organsky, then enriched by empirical research by Jacek Kugler, so Kugler-Organsky theory, that would be more scholarly approach to the Thucydides trap, and the complex interdependence theory created in late 70s by Joseph Nye and Robert Keohane, focusing on interdependencies between United States and China. I'll start with the way of measuring power, and of course different scholars were trying to find the best way of measuring power, as it's really important to know how strong your possible enemy or your competitor is. Hence we can find at least 2-3 dozens of those ways. I refer to the one created and published by Enrico Fels called Composite Index on Aggregate Power that is actually slightly modified Klein's formula. Ray Klein was CIA and Department of Defense analyst that created simple formula, relatively simple, still more than 40 indicators that you take into account, based on the size of your territory, population, your economy, and the military. If you try to compare United States and China using this theory, this index, you would see that in early 90s, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union has fallen, US was more or less 3 times stronger than the People's Republic of China. In 2012, where I more or less would root my the starting point of my analysis, that would be the moment when Barack Obama pivot to Asia strategy was on the full swing, we would have around almost 1-to-1, with almost 90 points for China, if I can say so, and 100 for the United States. At the Trump era, they more or less equaled the aggregated power, so People's Republic of China versus United States. The question that appeared then was what to do, presuming you're American leader, American president, to either slow down China's gain of power or increase American capabilities. You could do both. And both leaders, so Barack Obama and Donald Trump, had different approaches. I will add one more issue that become more complicated with COVID-19 pandemics, because China, even though its economic growth has slowed down, was more successful in dealing with the pandemic, and it still kept positive GDP growth. In 2020, it was more than 2%. In 2021, it was more than 8%, whereas US had negative growth, minus 3.5 in 2020, and returned to the positive growth path in 2021. However, that was slower, 6.4%. China also accelerated its exports in 2020, so the first year of pandemic in the full swing, whereas US exports decreased by more than 13% at the same time. So the gap between the United States and China, if we could say so, was diminished by the pandemic. China advanced more than the United States. So we got to the point when we search other sources of American power, and those sources I would locate in this regulatory power connected to international organizations or institutions. US role in the world, to a large extent, was based on those regulatory influence. In the UN, however, till 1960s, then Soviets become more important player in the UN. Regional political military alliances like TIA, the Rio Pact, NATO, ANZUS, SEATO, or CENTO, some of them still exist, like ANZUS or NATO. But predominantly or crucial elements of this dominance would be located in financial or economic institutions, both global, that is the case of International Monetary Fund, and the so-called World Bank or World Bank Group, the 5 institutions built around International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, plus regional development banks. This is Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Inter-American Development Bank. In all those 5 institutions, US keep dominant position understood as a veto power. Yeah, so it has up to 17% of votes, whereas the decision requires 84% of votes, simplifying the issues. Of course, China is trying to build, or either to increase its influence in those institutions or build parallel institutions. And this is the case of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, created by Xi Jinping, or created by China, led by Xi Jinping. There are some institutions US had problems with, and that would be the WTO, World Trade Organization, with Donald Trump clearly neglecting its role and China using its better and better since it had joined more than 20 years ago. Of course, World Health Organization becoming visible during a COVID pandemic was also a significant element strengthening China in the international system, yeah, with the US not being able to play properly those institutional arrangements that could be used there. Finally, we had regional economic agreements that could easily or relatively easily strengthen American position, and that were used by Barack Obama to create agreements with no China, or open to China but on American conditions. Yeah, there was Trans-Pacific Partnership initiated in early 21st century, but in reality pushed by Barack Obama and finally concluded in 2015, and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Both those institutions were neglected by Donald Trump. He decided that US would withdraw from Trans-Pacific Partnership, opening field for China to promote RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, created in East Asia, excluding the United States, and in TTIP, where US put those negotiations on hold somehow. The third element would be Middle Power Alliance, and if you look at the map of the Asia-Pacific, you would see that number of countries that are Chinese allies is still pretty limited. Basically, there was Laos and Cambodia. That was Myanmar till democratic transformation, and most likely since the latest coup, Myanmar, known also as Burma, would return into Chinese sphere of influence. And that's been surprisingly Pakistan shifting from the position of very important US ally into the position of Chinese ally in 21st century. That was connected with the US building much better relations with India in the same time. Other countries are generally supporting US either as treaty allies. It's Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, or informal allies. This is the case of Singapore, for instance, but also India being part of the so-called Quad, strengthened by both Obama and especially by Donald Trump. I can briefly also refer to the strategies. Strategies of both presidents differed significantly, with Barack Obama promoting pivot to Asia, pivot or rebalance to Asia strategy. That was fully justified with the developments in Asia. I won't go into details here, but I would just say that there were three basic elements. Strengthened US military in the region, that was usually focused by the analysts, and that included relocation of some military units to the bases in the Asia-Pacific region, like Marines to base in Darwin, also strengthening US deployed forces in Korea, in Japan, and some temporarily, I would say, bases to relocation to the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, Cam Bay, etc. Then strengthening U.S. role in multilateral institutions, like joining East Asia Summit in 2011. And finally, building Trans-Pacific Partnership that seemed to be crucial. That guaranteed the U.S. keeping relatively strong position, regulatory position. So the U.S. was the creator of norms and rules in the region, despite its diminishing power, the aggregate power of the United States. In terms of China, Barack Obama was perceived as not Chinese antagonist on the one hand, but on the other, gradually from the first to second term, we observed a stronger anti-Chinese stance. Barack Obama, also in his strategic documents, stressed the fact that China is a competitor. However, there was not necessarily confrontation coming with China. Of course, there were areas like cybersecurity, like Chinese military modernization or human rights issues that the U.S. was concerned about during Obama's term. But summing up this strategy, I would focus on the fact that Obama strengthened this multilateral dimension of its foreign policy much more than his successor, all successors, so both Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump entered the White House with a strong anti-Chinese message. This message was weakened in political terms in first month of Trump's presidency. He recognized one China policy. He invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago, where they said that relations between both countries were outstanding. China joined US-led anti-North Korean sanctions, etc. But at the same time, Donald Trump was rooted in kind of Cold War logic against China, against PRC, strengthening this bloc called Quad, composed of US, Australia, Japan, and India, strengthening military ties with Thailand, Philippines, but increasing role of Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and predominantly running what we call the trade war between United States and China. The trade war was based on set of Cold War provisions in two acts, Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and Trade Act of 1974. So we've initially seen introduction of Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974, when temporary protective measures, tariffs, were introduced, protecting American market from imports of washing machines and solar panels from China. That was the first step. We still haven't called it the trade war. Followed by Section 232, when steel imports from China was targeted. In reality, that was lobbied by American steel aluminum producers, even though China was only the 8th biggest source of American trade imports. And finally, the most important, Section 301 of Trade Act of 1974, where United States Trade Representative could virtually impose sanctions on all the imports from China, because the category of justifications is pretty broad there. Trump, even though he was called or perceived as a person not necessarily following all the rules, was simply following the regulations. So it takes usually around a year to impose these sanctions, and there were 3 institutions engaged into this process. That was United States Trade Representative, International Trade Commission, and the Department of Commerce. So at the end of 2019, almost all experts from both countries, so mutual experts, were under sanctions of the United States and the reciprocal sanctions of China. However, Chinese imports from the US is, of course, much lower than American imports from China. In 2020, we observed gradual lift of sanctions after Stage 1 agreement between US and China, preceded by G20 summit agreements from Buenos Aires, from the previous year. In 2021, when Joe Biden took power, everybody was portraying him as a president that will think about ending the trade war. This has not happened. He lifted some of those sanctions, but basically most of them stayed in place. So that was closer to Stage 1 agreement than to the pre-Trump relations between United States and China. That is important, that in this respect, Biden is rather following the Trump approach. In 2018, that is also important, Donald Trump has reinforced American allies in the region with the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, and built around what he called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, stressing the fact that US is the one to play the pivotal role in the region, and strong US leadership is necessary in the Indo-Pacific region. That was followed by a set of congressional appropriations for especially security programs. $1.5 billion a year was authorized by the Congress. Democracy promotion, cooperation projects, that was $100 million annually, respectively, and some other projects. I won't go into details here. What would conclude Trump's term would be the document created by Department of State policy planning staff and published in November 2020. This document became kind of a last will, we could say, of Donald Trump, but it was designed as a new opening in relations with China for Trump's second term. As we know, Trump lost the election and Joe Biden took power. That is a very strong document, stressing the fact that Chinese Communist Party is aiming at revising current world order and put China in the center of this new world order, of this new international system, in order to serve authoritarian goals, hegemonic ambitions of China, using world-class military that is developed into world-class military, and the economic cooptation and coercion that was analyzed both in regional dimension but also in the global dimension. In the chapter and our subchapter entitled The Sources of China's Conduct, the planners from the DOS said that Chinese behavior, Chinese conduct is based on Xi Jinping's synthesis of communism and Chinese nationalism. Why I refer to this subchapter entitled Sources of Chinese Conduct? Because that is that's clearly connected with the article published in 1947 in Foreign Affairs entitled Sources of Soviet Conduct, signed with X. That's why it's known as Article X, and being a starting point of this doctrine created by George Kennan. That was anyhow the author of the article, but at that time couldn't be revealed. that was the containment policy against the Soviet Union in 1947. And the starting point of the Cold War, one of these crucial elements that initiated the Cold War. So we could observe that the end of Trump presidency was connected with very strong declarations, anti-Chinese declarations, almost the new Cold War period between the United States and China. Also with the sentence that I would quote, in the face of China challenge, the United States must secure freedom. That was still before Russian aggression, of course, on Ukraine. The goals would be changed now. You cannot fight wars on so many fronts. When we look at Joe Biden's interim national security guidance, national security strategy has not been published yet for this president. He focuses on Chinese assertiveness, focuses on competition with China, and portrays China as a competitor that is capable of undermining a stable, open international system using its economic, diplomatic, military, technological potential. If so, the U.S. strategy is based on the goal of winning this competition with China, as China acts aggressively or even coercively to undermine open, stable international system. However, cooperation with China is also possible here, with strong focus on support of China discriminated or persecuted groups like Uyghurs in Xinjiang, people in Hong Kong, people in Tibet, and the cooperation with Taiwan. That is also very, very dangerous for China. Yeah? So China would like to have Taiwan controlled by them. What if Graham Allison is right and there would be a war with China? Economic estimations prepared as part of the analysis published by Rand Corporation. Rand Corporation is a think tank focusing on military and strategic issues created by and financed by U.S. government. So the report said that U.S. could lose 5 to 10% of its GDP, and China could lose 25 to 35% of its GDP. That would probably lead to the end of China as possible global power and the end of Chinese Communist Party rule in the country. So for China, that would be much more dangerous than for the United States, being anyhow a democratic country. And if we try to refer to what I started with, so the theoretical background, if we look at power transition theory, China is definitely an aspiring power. China is gaining economic momentum and utilizing it for military buildup. And looking at the theory, we could say it is somewhere in the transitional stage. The way China has to go to reach the United States in terms of military potential is really long. Within 20-30 years, Chinese military could be equivalent to American military if China spends much more on its military, much more than it actually spends. At the same time, China is benefiting a lot from the current trade system or global economic system, building or basing still its development to a large extent on export, even though this ratio of export in China's GDP has been diminishing, especially in the last 10, 15 years, let's say since a global financial crisis. Hence, there is no need and no reason for China to start this conflict. On the other hand, complex interdependence theory shows us that both sides are interested in keeping relatively positive bilateral relations, and this is because US is the most important export market for China, but this export surplus in goods, in services, US has a surplus versus China, that's the biggest surplus comparing all American service trade partners, generates money that can be utilized in China for the purposes useful in the US. Yeah, so pretty often the money is invested into American sovereign bonds, allowing the US to reduce its interest rates, lowering inflationary pressure, reducing prices for consumers, also costs of credit, increasing competitiveness of American companies because they have cheaper loans. Moreover, pretty often the goods exported to the US are exported by companies that are either owned or co-owned, basically co-owned due to Chinese regulations, by American companies. Yeah, they're just subsidiaries of American companies. And more than 50% of Chinese export may be attributed to companies that are foreign owned. So those links are pretty close, and that is a factor making relations more positive. Finally, if we try to compare those three administrations, we can see that all presidents, with President Biden, we have limited knowledge still, were playing with similar goals, similar aims. Yeah, they wanted to keep American prevalence in the system. That is natural. They simply used different tools. Barack Obama was trying to strengthen second and third components of American power. So, regulatory position based on international institutions, either fully formalized like international organizations or trade agreements like Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump was trying to weaken China, waging a trade war with China. And Joe Biden is somewhere in between, using both realist trade war tools and trying to rebuild at least American reputation among allies and international institutions. So far, he has not returned to abandoned idea of TPP, for instance, and Trans-Pacific Partnership. But we could expect that may happen. So my conclusion is, surprisingly, those three American presidents first are playing pretty similar game. Secondly, the initial question whether they are destined for war should be answered no. There are many factors preventing both superpowers from waging a war. China, in case it's not prevented, would lose much more. Thank you.